Okay, we are live. Welcome, 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 and one more welcome to everybody. Part of our continuing series where we talk to professors, activists, reporters, writers, columnists, anybody on the left, anybody on the right. We just want to get complete thoughts and perspectives and package them unedited and unaltered, available to you directly to the public so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. With us today, it is our extreme privilege to have Professor Matthew Levendusky of the Pennsylvania University Arts and Sciences Political Science Department. Professor Levendusky is an American political scientist best known for his 2009 book, The Partisan Sort: How Liberals Became Democrats and Conservatives Became Republicans. His work has primarily focused on explaining political polarization, but also includes media analysis and topics related to public opinion and American foreign policy. Raised in Pittsburgh, later attending Pennsylvania State University. After graduating, he entered the PhD political science program at Stanford University, one of the best universities in the country, by the way. He's a runner-up for the National Science Foundation grant to attend Stanford, where he attended a PhD in political science. After completing his dissertation in 2006, Levendusky spent a year as a postdoctoral research associate at Yale University in the Center for the Study of American Politics in the Institution for Social and Political Sciences. He is now a professor of political science, as well as the chair of the Stephen and Mary Barron Chair in the Institutions of Democracy at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He was previously been a visiting researcher at the European University Institute and Aarhus University, the Penny and Robert A. Fox Director of the Fels Institute Government, Distinguished Fellow in the Institution of Democracy, the Annenberg Public Policy Center, Graduate Group Chairperson, Associate Professor, and Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, and Postdoctoral Research Associate at the Center for the Study of American Politics at Yale University. We already covered that. Since 2014, he has also served at the decision desk as a decision desk analyst for NBC News, very prestigious. He's the author of Partisan Sort: How Partisan Media Polarize America and Our Common Bonds, Using What Americans Share to Overcome Partisan Divide. He's also the co-author of We Need to Talk: How Cross-Party Dialogue Reduces Effective Polarization, and also Democracy Amid Crisis: Polarization, Pandemic, Protest, and Persuasion. He's also the co-author of American Government Institutions and Policies, and he's the co-author of American Government Institutions and Policies Brief Edition. His work has also appeared in the American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, Public Opinion Quarterly, Nature, Human Behavior, that's a very prestigious publication, as well as a variety of other leading journals. He is quoted often in a variety of media outlets, both nationally and internationally, including the New York Times, Boston Globe, USA Today, CNN, and many others. He has been honored with numerous awards, including the 2011 Jewel Lowenberg Award, the 2013 Best Paper Award for the Journal of Politics, the 2022 Rebecca Morton Best Article from the Journal of Experimental Political Science, and the 2014 Goldsmith Book Prize from Harvard University Shorenstein Center, and the 2016 Eric Erickson Early Career Award for the International Society of Political Psychology. Eric Erickson is one of the grandfathers of psychology for everybody. And these are some of the books that he's written: The Partisan Sort: How Liberals Became Democrats and Conservatives Became Republicans. Also, this chapter are Fox and MSNBC Polarizing America. That's how I initially found them. In Political Politics in American Politics. He also wrote this: Can Information Persuade Rather Than Polarize? Also wrote Democracy Amid Crisis: Polarization, Pandemic, Protest, and Persuasion. Also, this study, Measuring District-Level Partisanship with Implications for the Analysis of U.S. Elections. And finally, the book that I read, Our Common Bonds: Using What Americans Share to Help Bridge the Partisan Divide. But before we get into all those, let's check in and see how well we did. Professor, did I get anything wrong? Do we need to correct something?
No, that was great. That was the most thorough introduction I think I've ever received.
Thank you. All right. Okay. Good work, team. You've written many books on political polarization. Usually when I interview somebody, they've written one or two things and I can focus on that. But since you've written so many, I want to start off asking you some general questions.
Sure.
You're talking about political sorting, and you've obviously heard of the partisan sort. You've also heard of Bill Bishop, I think, in the sorting of America. What is your book about, the partisan sort, and does it conclude that we have had a big sort, like Bill Bishop indicated?
Yeah, so I mean, we can take this in a couple of, let's take it in two parts, right? So the first thing, what the partisan sort is about a process. So if we went back to say the 1960s or even the 1970s, right? At that time, you would have had lots of liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, right? So to use like examples, right, we can think about a liberal Democrat like Jacob Javits, right, or a conservative, liberal Republican like Jacob Javits, or a conservative Democrat like John Stennis, right? So many of the conservative Democrats in the South, many of the liberal Republicans in the Northeast. And if we were to look at the kind of ordinary public, right, we'd see sort of similar trends, right? But if you look at both kind of congressional data, but also in the public, you've seen that over time, people have sort of, sorted themselves into the right camp, right? If you want to think of it that way, right? Where right just means you sort of look more like the political elites on your side, like the elected officials, the activist, those sorts of things, right? So the partisan sort takes a look at that, trying to explain that process from the voter's point of view, and basically the argument is that as political elites kind of sorted themselves out, that helped the public to figure it out, right? So you take remember that Richard Nixon is the president, right, who founds the EPA, introduces wage and price controls, right, does a bunch of things that we would think of as being quite heterodox from the perspective of like the contemporary Republican Party.
Almost liberal.
Yes, but you flash forward to someone like George W. Bush, right? We'll set Trump aside because he's sort of anomalous in a
Thank you.
place.
Thank you.
Right. But someone like Bush, right, takes much, what we think of by the contemporary standards, much more sort of orthodox conservative positions, right? As political elites do that, we see that happening in Congress, largely, but not completely, due to that kind of realignment of the South. The ordinary voters can kind of do that the same way. So Bishop's argument in the big sort is about geographic sorting, right? And there's part of that's very real, right? If you go to communities near where I live in Philadelphia, right, and you maybe went out to Narberth or Ardmore, right, this kind of classic suburbs right outside of Philadelphia, right, you'd see a lot of, if we did this next year in 2024, we'd see a lot of Biden signs, right? We'd see, the sign saying, in this house, we believe that science is real, Black Lives Matter, right? The whole sort of panoply of beliefs, right? So part of that is going to be a very, very real thing, right? But I think it's also important to recognize that there is part of that where people kind of sort into that, but that process also goes the other way, because there's been work by some other folks that shows, right, that it's not just sort of a one-way thing, it's both ways. And also important to keep in mind that a lot of communities are at the, not that maybe the smallest level, but at the kind of, broader level, like kind of zoomed out to say like the county level, are still at least reasonably competitive, right? That we tend to think of these like very stark examples, right? But there's still, there's still counties, right, that are moving back and forth, and those are the ones that are really in a way having the biggest impact, because they're able to help do these things, right? So if we look at counties that go really Republican or really Democratic, right, in the contemporary era, right, the really Republican ones are going to be very, very rural counties. So if you look at a map, you would see like a lot of red, but it's also important to keep in mind not very many people live in many of those places.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Very long answer.
No, I appreciate it. On the screen, I appreciate the confirmation. So on the screen, we have some information about the big sort. It was corroborated by, NPR talked about it in 2008, 2017, 2022, said it's true. The New York Times looked at it in 2016, about a decade after Bishop, and totally confirmed it. There's also a study 2018. And basically what they're showing is, just for the public, so if you look at the maps, the map at the top left is 1992. And the map at the bottom left, I know it says 1992 over it, but that's a mistake. The map at the bottom left is the 2016 election. So the 1992 is the top left, and then at the bottom left is 2016. And if you go to 1992, red equals Republican landslide county. Don't even run here. Republicans win by 20 percentage points over Democrats. Blue equals Democratic landslide county. Don't even run here. Democrats win by over 20 percentage points. But most of the country was gray, which they were calling competitive elections. And this is for presidential elections at the county level, but it also backs up with congressional elections. Most of it is gray. Half the country is competitive. You can go down to 2016, which is the map on the bottom left, just below the word 1992. I apologize. Almost all the grays wiped out. And it's almost all landslide voting districts. Does that corroborate with what you understand the sorting goes in with America? Is that because this seems to be a big question. There's two questions that I keep running into with professors. Is the public itself polarized or just elites? And did the big sort happen or did it not happen at all?
Okay, so let's take those in a couple of steps. So at the presidential level, right, we've seen things get a lot more polarized. But in many ways, think about the president kind of becomes the exemplars for the party, right? And so the Trump-Biden comparison is actually kind of a good one there, right? Or if you don't like that one, take Trump-Clinton, right? Or Romney-Obama, right? You have people who are very polarizing, right? In part because it's this big, very nationalized sort of campaign, right? So you end up with these things where, like, yes, you're going to see a lot of this just because it's so nationalized and so political, right? But if we were to go down a couple of levels, we'd see a somewhat different picture, right? It's not to say that, look, that there's one robust finding in political science, right? It is that partisanship determines people's voting behavior, like, consistently, right? So that people who are, Democratic tend to vote for Democratic candidates, people who are Republican tend to vote for Republican candidates, right? It's this sort of smaller group of kind of independent sort of swing voters, most of whom are somewhat more politically unengaged, who end up kind of determining what happens at a lot of things because a lot of other people are locked down, especially at those most nationalized levels, right? But even if we were to go down to governors, right, we see a somewhat different picture, right? So the most popular governor in America, according to Morning Consult, is Phil Scott, the Republican governor of Vermont, right? Vermont, very blue state, right? Sends Bernie Sanders to the Senate, right? Voted, I don't remember what they voted, for Biden in 2020, but it would have been, overwhelmingly Democratic state, right? But they have a Republican governor. He's really popular, right? Because people are able to kind of unhinge that a little bit differently, with that kind of approach. And, if you look at those Morning Consult ratings, I was actually just talking about them this morning with one of my colleagues. It's really striking that almost every governor, I think maybe the only exception might be Tate Reeves with Mississippi, we need to put a little asterisk next to him, given all the issues with the Brett Favre scandal. They're all actually net positive, right? Or, only minorly net negative, which is kind of striking if you think about it, right? Especially in, these very close competitive states, right? Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, right? These are states, Georgia, Arizona, that next year are going to be decided by 2 points or less, right?
Right.
It's sort of a game
many times in Georgia.
That a lot of that will hinge on what happens with the economy between now and then, right? Those places tend to have governors that are, on balance net positive, right? Which is a sort of interesting thing, suggesting that people kind of maybe can make some differentiations between like okay, the presidential thing where, the way in which we talk about, Biden or Trump, or the way in which we talk about, Kevin McCarthy versus Nancy Pelosi, or Chuck Schumer versus Mitch McConnell, is just different than the way we think about our governor, or right, maybe state or county officials. Because there's also been some really interesting papers in political science where they've gotten ballot image data, which is you don't know who the voter is, right? But in some states where you vote electronically, it preserves a paper image of the ballot, so you know every position someone took, right? And so you can see that, like, yes, there are a lot of people who kind of just vote straight ticket, but that tends to be most true, like at the presidential and congressional level. But then you see a lot of people who maybe voted, for Biden and then for the Democrat for Congress, right? Maybe they voted for a Republican for governor or a Republican for county commissioner, right? And that some of these lower level offices, people are able to kind of break out of some of that, kind of polarized thinking a little bit, in part because, right, people are dealing with issues that are kind of more immediate, more local to their context, and less about these kind of very inflamed, kind of nationalized sorts of issues that tend to dominate so much of the rhetoric that we see in Washington, D.C.
Right. I could see that. Two follow-up questions. So is it fair to say, because I've seen a lot of talk saying that, okay, I get what you're saying, local elections are less polarized, but there's a lot of people saying, besides the presidency, the Congress, House elections, and the Senate elections are also polarized. Like maybe they weren't before, but they are now. The Senate definitely with the House. Would that be reasonable to say that when we're looking at national elections, congressional, Senate, and presidential, we're seeing polarization, but not at the state level? Go down to your school board, go down to your local state elected official. That's where you might be able to get out of these heated national debates that we see on television and social media, and people could just vote based upon local issues. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, although, I think I would say two things, right? So one is that, yes, and that's right, but we also do see, right, as nationalizations become a bigger force, some of those issues playing out, right? We've seen that in a lot of school board debates. For example, the school district where I went to high school now has a whole new review process for looking at books that can be put in the high school library, right? So we have seen some of that, go down there. But the other thing I would say about that is that when we tend to see that sort of nationalization going on, right, it's not that we should ignore it. It's important. It's something, we should think about and understand. But it often tends to be the work of activists who have a particular political agenda to go there, right? More so than like, oh, this is really this upswell of community, support. So that often these things are driven by, small numbers of very politically engaged people, right? And might not actually reflect the true views of what's actually happening there.
Fair. But fair enough. I've seen a lot of that. Activists, super engaged voters, the people that donate more and volunteer more and picket more and make more phone calls and show up at the primaries, somewhat tend to steer these politicians further and further apart towards more extremes. I've seen a lot of that mentioned. But you are saying it is safe to say that we're starting to see some signs. I didn't say a bunch. Some signs that polarization may be being pushed to the local state level.
Yeah, with certain types of issues, right? So we saw all of this with debates over, critical race theory, right? Which is not really about critical race theory, but
right.
Debates over, curricula, school boards, right? Those sorts of things, right? Because part of what activists also do is they look for issues on both sides, right, that they can strategically exploit to kind of advance their particular point of view, right? So when they see an opening, right, they see that that's part of what it means to, be an activist.
How big are these activist groups that are pushing our two political parties to these extremes? I've heard this theory a lot. Hey, it's not all the voters. It's just some extreme activists. But they seem to be able to direct these parties to extreme stances increasingly over the last 30 years. How big are they? And because for whatever their size is, I've heard, oh, these are small people, this is a small group. Okay, but they seem to be controlling every election for the last 3 decades. So if they're small, they're impactful. Would that be fair?
Yeah, and so part of the way to think about this, right? So there's a famous book by the late political scientist Jim Wilson called "The Amateur Democrat," and Democrat, it's small d Democrat, not so this means both Democrats and Republicans. Democrat here just meaning like people who engage in politics, right? And so if you were to go back, right, the kind of classic story of politics, right, is sort of like a, for lack of a better word, kind of like political machines, right? These groups of people where politics was kind of more transactional, right? And then in like the mid 20th century, right, what did people start to do? They were like, well, we have to clean these things up. We need good governance, right? And what we have to do is kind of let the people decide, right? Which on the face of it sounds great.
Yeah.
But think about the kinds of people who tend to want to go to school board meetings, want to go to zoning board meetings, want to vote in primaries, who want to volunteer for campaigns, right? Who make these small dollar donations, right, to candidates, right? These are people who care very deeply about the issues, right? So that, the people who, on the one hand, you might say, well, it's great. The people who care the most are the ones who are getting involved. But we also know the people who care the most are also the people who tend to have these really extreme
Thank you.
positions.
Thank you.
Right. So like abortion is a really good example of this. Right. So lots of folks have studied this. Right. Mo Fiorina at Stanford wrote a famous book called Culture War. Right. And the same thing has been true since the last edition of the book, which was published, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago. If you look at the public's attitudes on abortion, they've actually been really stable over the last 50 years. Gallup shows this as well, right? The people are, in the phrase that I really always like to use from Fiorina, pro-choice butts, right? So they're generally, they generally say, yes, a woman should be able to have access to abortion, but I want some restrictions around that, right? But if you look at what the activists are doing, right, on either side, right, it's a much more kind of extreme position, right? And a lot of the kind of back and forth is about what these, the kind of activists on either side who want more kind of extreme positions versus most people in the middle who are kind of like, well, I'd like some sort of moderate kind of compromise position.
Yeah, I've heard the classic debate is between Fiorina and a guy called Abramowitz.
Mm-hmm.
They are both brilliant men. They both have a lot of research, and they 100% absolutely, completely could not disagree with each other more. And they're both saying that they're going in two different directions on this issue, from what I've seen.
Yeah, I think what I would say maybe like when I teach this, like part of what I try to convey to students is that I think they're both right, but are looking at slightly different things, right? So I think Abramowitz tends to say, if you look at these people who are, more involved, more engaged, right? Those people have become kind of more extreme over time, right? And Fiorina's like, well, if you look at, like the kind of broad mass of voters, right, that they haven't changed nearly as much, right? And it's important to keep in mind, like if you look at lots of these measures of engagement or political knowledge, that most people just aren't that interested in politics, right? And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? People are busy. They have a lot of other stuff going on in their lives. So for them, politics isn't a sort of central concern, right? So there's a famous line from the late Robert Dahl that politics is but a sideshow in the great circus of life. Soon no one will know what that means because no one will know what a circus is, but he wrote in the 50s, 1961, so made more sense at the time. But for most people, politics is a sort of secondary concern that they maybe pay attention when there's a presidential election, right? But otherwise, they're not that included. And so the kinds of people who are really engaged and active are the people who are really following it, right? Versus kind of other people who are just kind of trying to live their lives.
I just, in both of their books, Fiorina says, people need to stop talking about how the public's polarized. And then Abramowitz will mention what Fiorina says and then literally say, I completely disagree in his books. I've read 3 of them. He does that. So just putting it out, these guys do not share the same opinion. I have heard this theory, though, because it's confused me. And I think it's confused a lot of people who are studying this. How do we have 2 really smart people who are looking at the same? or looking at research and coming to different conclusions. I heard this theory. I was from a different professor, and I was wondering what you thought about this. One professor said, like you, well, they're both right. Fiorina is talking about political polarization. Technically means difference over policy different issues. There hasn't been that much change. Like we're talking about, most people want safe schools where kids aren't shot. Most people believe women have the right to choose. Most people believe, et cetera, healthcare. But Abramowitz is talking about effective polarization. And he's saying, okay, maybe the people aren't politically polarized, but they really are broken up into two groups. It affects the mass public, and this group doesn't like the other group. And so we can say that actually the people are polarized themselves and not just the elites when we look at the concept of effective polarization. What do you think about this theory?
Yeah, so there's a lot, it's important to draw that distinction, right? So political polarization, issue-based polarization, right, is going to be like, do people disagree on, say, kind of gun control more than they used to, right? And there's like maybe a little bit of increase, but not that much. There's a lot more towards this affective or just kind of visceral dislike. How much you can separate those two things is a matter of some debate. But generally speaking, we can think of them as sort of distinct phenomena. I think one thing, though, that I would say on the affective polarization and some of the work that I've done is that when you ask, a lot of those questions will say, like, they might give you something called, the social scientists call it feeling thermometer, right? That says,
Right.
okay, we're going to ask you to, they would show you a little graph of the thermometer, and they say, like, okay, people you really dislike are at 0, people you really like are at 100, people you're indifferent towards are at 50. And they say, how do you think about Republicans, right? And so people, if you ask them that question, if you ask a Democrat that question, who will they think of? Well, they'll say, when I think about Republican, who comes to mind? Okay, well, Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, Mitch McConnell, right? My classmate from high school who's always ranting on Facebook. And they think of these really extreme exemplars, right? Because those are the kind of people who tend to come to mind if I just ask you to list things off, especially for a group that you're not a part of, right? So something like the other party, right? And that's true of all kinds of different groups, right? This is what social psychologists call outgroup homogeneity, right? That we tend to think of these kind of extreme examples and say, like, oh yeah, well, everyone in that group is kind of like that, right?
Right.
So you tend to think of these really kind of like extreme examples. So in some work I did with some co-authors, what we did was we asked people to think about, we gave them like more information basically. And we kind of talked to them about how much these people like to talk about politics as a measure of kind of easy to understand political engagement, as well as how ideologically extreme they are. And we found that when you ask people about profiles that look more typical, right? So most people are kind of interested in politics, but not that really, and are, have some sort of positions but aren't really that ideologic extreme. People are much more kind of like, oh, I'm okay with that, kind of person. Like maybe I'm not thrilled with, if I'm a Democrat with a Republican, right? But they think about like kind of an ordinary voter who doesn't look like such a political caricature very differently than they do about these very kind of extreme nationalized figures.
We have some studies, I'm trying to find them, that, and this is one of the questions that I had for about Fiorina's work, is that Fiorina's been saying the people, aren't that polarized, but he's been saying that since 2008. And what I noticed is that in 2008 was before the Tea Party got going, before we had Joe Wilson, I think, say "you lie" to Obama, which had never happened before in American history, before Trump, before January 6th. And so I'm thinking, you're saying the people aren't polarized, and things have continued to get worse and involve more people. And January 6th, I mean, just blew the top off of it. I'm trying to find the references, but there's also a lot of references showing that in 2012, about 1/3 of Americans would not date someone outside of the political party. Now it's over half. So it's risen to over half of the American population won't date someone out of the political party. There's another study showing that they won't marry someone out of the political party. They don't want anyone in their family doing that. And that's now over half. There's also studies showing that kids are now sorting themselves into red and blue universities. These are all things happening at the mass public level. Can we say that polarization isn't happening to the mass public when we can literally look at data and we can literally track it showing, wow, these people, you used to be able to go, I don't like the fact that my daughter or my son's dating a Republican or Democrat, and maybe make a few jokes and you get over it. Now it's like, I will disown you and we don't have a family together and you're not allowed to do that. And it's over half the population. And that was not existed in 2008, not existed in 2009, 2010, but it's gradually gone from 2012 to here. Can't we say that people are polarized?
So, I mean, I think the thing that I would say in response to that, right, is it's in a way the kind of same answer I gave to the last question that if I just said to you, like, would you be willing to date a Republican, right, if you're a Democrat, right? You think about someone who is a very, let's say, like an ardent, Republican, someone who's going to show up with a "Make America Great Again," hat on, and to, you talk about the fact that they're an NRA member, like on the first date, right? People are going to
Stereotype.
Yeah, they think about, like, if I just ask you about that, you're like, well, no, I don't want to date that, right? Or if you're a Republican, you might say, like, well, I don't want to date someone who thinks police are terrible and that you're guilty by association if you're white, right? You can, whatever kind of stereotype positions you want to hold of either side, right? That you're going to bring up a lot of these very kind of extreme things, right? And so that if it turned out the person you were going to date was someone who was kind of like, yeah, I guess I voted for, Trump, but, it was because I liked to turn on taxes or whatever, right? That's maybe a little bit different, right? And so that's the kind of trouble with a lot of these questions. They're very by their nature and trying to be kind of inclusive, they leave you to fill in a lot of the details. And one of the things we know from work that people have done in survey research is that when you leave when you leave people to kind of fill in those blanks, right, they tend to do it in very particular kind of exaggerated sort of ways, right? And so as the discourse kind of moves in a different way, right, you're going to see people do that, right? Because the types of exemplars that you're going to see talked about, this exemplar is just a fancy academic way of saying example, are going to kind of, that's going to then change the way, people are going to answer those questions, right? So is there, right, is there a growth in these things? Sure. But on the other hand, like, we also know from like voter file data that, politically, that most intimate relationships are homogenous on lots of dimensions, right? Not just politics, but on race, on class, on education, right? So it's not a huge surprise that we would also see that play out politically.
I'm just saying I've talked to a lot of people. I'm in California. It's super politically charged here. My family's from Texas. I have contacts in New York. I've also interviewed about 70 professors across America for this. Everybody's saying, I've lost relationships. I've lost friends. I've lost family. And then I see these studies on top of it that say they won't date, they won't marry, they won't go to the same schools. They're also isolating themselves in separate neighborhoods. So we have a lot of personal anecdotal data and then a lot of survey data that all seems to be pointing in one direction. And in the opposite, we have national surveys that say, well, people generally agree that, gun regulation is good and safety, safe schools. And it's difficult to say, which should we believe? Because we have one set of surveys backed up by personal observations, and then we have another set of surveys that are saying there's no real polarization. Basically the people agree on these policy issues, and yet when you talk to the actual people, they don't really feel that at that level. So why the disconnect?
I mean, I think in a way it's one of the things, like, you kind of sort of have to hold two contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time, because there's, I think, an element of truth in both, right? Is there an increasing amount of division? Sure. But at the same time, are there things that people still can kind of agree on and base on, right? The answer is also yes, right? So in some of the work that I've done, right, one of the things that that I found and my co-authors have found as we've done these studies is that people, because they carry around a lot of these misperceptions of the other side, right? There's a lot of value in having people have a genuine conversation with people who disagree with them, right? And that doesn't very often yield persuasion, right? What it yields, if it is done well, and there's some tricks to getting it to go well, or tricks is the wrong word, steps to getting it to go well,
Fair
um,
enough.
is that you might sort of say like, oh, I didn't realize why you felt that way, right? Or it hadn't occurred to me that you would have that, like, an actual argument for your point of view, right? And so, like, there is certainly a backdrop of polarization, right? There are very real divisions between people, right? And there's, it's silly to sort of, suggest otherwise, right? But that doesn't mean that everything has to fall into this kind of like spiral of polarization. And the other thing I would say is that when political communication scholars talk about why do the media cover some topics rather than others, right? One of the key things that they look for, right, because it makes stories interesting, is kind of division, conflict, right, points of tension, right, and story that just kind of says like, oh, it turns out people actually agree on a lot of these things, and that there's some sort of value in both sides. Like, it's not like a super interesting story. Like, most people aren't that interested in politics. Like, okay, not super
If
interesting.
it bleeds, it leads, right, Professor?
Yeah, I mean, that's just kind of like that's kind of the way it goes. That it's sort of, we see the same thing like as we go through the kind of primaries, that like part of the reason why like the media likes to have a kind of new exciting story to kind of talk about, right? And so that's part of what they do.
So is that what you were getting at in this chapter here? Are Fox and MSNBC polarizing America and political polarizations in American politics? I've seen a lot of professors say the national news media, 24-hour cycle news, and they're focused on one particular bent. And they've realized that making people mad and having politicians who say outrageous things is great for ratings, and great for ratings means more money in advertising. Is that what you're saying, or are you taking a different stance, Professor?
Yeah, so this was a somewhat different argument. So that essay is based on some work I did for my second book on partisan media. And what that essay is arguing, based on a set of experiments that I did, that what seems to happen when people watch Fox and MSNBC is there is some persuasion, right? But part of what's also going on is that a lot of the effect of these shows are driven by the people who kind of self-select into them, who are already somewhat more extreme, right?
Okay.
So it's not so much the case that Fox and CNN sort of make people super, take people who are centrist and make them ideologues. It's more that the kinds of people who opt into watching Fox or MSNBC, right? Because it's very particular subsets of the population, right? Even the most popular cable news shows have an audience of 2 to 3 million viewers a night, right? The CUME is going to be a little bit higher, right? But it's a small fraction of the public that, with any regularity watches cable news. All right, it's taking people who are kind of like sort of extreme and pushing them a little bit more towards the ideological poles.
So people aren't turning on Fox and MSNBC and saying, I'm a moderate, I'm an independent, and after a few months going, I'm an extreme partisan. What happens is they're already partisan, they're already extremely polarized, and then they search out their own echo chamber.
Yeah, they're looking for, I mean, I think you have to think of those shows not even so much as information, but as a blend of information and entertainment, right? That this is more about giving you a kind of news that is going to fit with the particular, sort of narrative of the world. And a lot of that is going to be actually bad things that the other side does, even
Right.
more so than good things that your side does, because that's sort of like in-group reinforcing. Because it's like, if you watch Fox, it's look at these crazy things Democrats are doing. If you watch MSNBC, it's look at these crazy things Republicans are doing.
I really appreciate you mentioning both. And that kind of explains this concept that affected polarization. Why are the masses so upset at each other? Well, they're watching some of them are watching these news shows that constantly say, we're not really focused on presenting news. We're really focused on talking about how the other side's bad. And we see a lot of polarization of the political affected polarization seems to be less on, I like the policies of my side versus I just don't like the other side.
Yeah, no, and I think if you look at no one's really done this polling on the other side because it's not as relevant. But if you look at some of the polling, and there's really great polling, a lot of the really great polling coming out of the CBS YouGov team, and they did a bunch of polls of likely Republican voters, right? And the kinds of things that were very important to them weren't really substantive positions. It was just more, what do you want in a nominee? And it's someone who says that Trump won 2020, someone who wants to, own the libs, who wants to
Right.
stop woke. Like it's these more kind of amorphous, sort of things rather than like, oh, I want someone who's going to, cut taxes and have a lot of deregulation and do, these other sorts of more policy focused positions.
Thank you. That helps out a lot. So let me, if I may ask you, I know that maybe you didn't study this specifically, but social media, the bad guy list goes immediately national cable news and then social media. And I've seen a lot of professors and a lot of newspapers and a lot of think tanks say, boy, if we just got rid of cable news and social media, poof, everything goes back together. No problems. Everybody loves each other. Does that make sense to you, Professor?
Well, I mean, I guess it's not a very whether or not it's true, it's not a very useful counterfactual because that's not something that's going to happen. Um, so, I mean, look, there are ways in which social media, monetizes attention in bad ways, right? Um, you know, in some ways, we're the product, right? When you're using it because they're trying to sell your eyeballs to consumers. But there are also people who are trying to do work to make those platforms kind of less polarizing. And I think, what I like to, when I talk to groups about this, way, I always like to remind people of is that there's been a bunch of studies that have done this, right? So Jamie Settle has a great book called Frenemies about this, but Pew also has data on this. It's something, the figures differ from study to study, but the vast majority of people really don't want to talk about talk about politics on social media,
Right.
because they're like, look, if I'm on social media, it's because um, I want to see my friends' grandkids on Facebook, right? Or I want to talk about XYZ on Twitter, or share photos of my vacation with my friends on Instagram, right? But there's a small number of people who really like to talk about politics all the time. It doesn't matter what the platform is. And what's also weird about those people is they're often not people who are very closely connected to us, right? So, it might be someone that I went to college with, right? Or went to high school with. But if it wasn't for social media, this is someone that I might see every 10 years in my high
Right.
school reunion. We don't live in the same town. We're not close friends anymore.
Right.
But because of social media, like their viewpoints are thrust into my timeline all the time. Right. So it's also important to remember it's this very kind of weird artificial space. Right. And so to think about that in the way that you approach the content that you see on it.
Um, I really appreciate that because not a lot of people will say that. There's a lot of solutions being offered right now to the lay public that say social media is the problem, cable news is the problem. If we could just get rid of those guys, regulate them, those are the bad guys, focus on them, everything gets fixed. Very few people are coming out and saying, even if you could do that, you're not going to be able to pull that off. Secondly, you're not going to put Pandora back in the Pandora's back in her box or make it go away. Secondly, would that even work in deflating everything? The issue that I always had was there was a lot of political polarization around the Monica Lewinsky scandal with Bill Clinton in the 90s. CNN was around, but you didn't have Fox or MSNBC, and you didn't have social media. But the public became super polarized and angry with each other because there was a website called The Drudge Report, and it polarized people. So we were already getting, you'd have to get rid of the internet, basically, is what I'm saying, to not have these sort of opportunities. How do we fix it? First, I wanted to ask a clarification question. I thought I heard you say, and I've seen other people say this, the more politically engaged you become, the more polarized you become. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little hard to know what direction what causes what there. But yeah, if we were just to look, the people who are the most extreme tend to be the ones who are also the most, politically engaged, right? And is that as I become more engaged, or I learn more about politics, and that pushes my opinions apart? Or is it that people who have strong opinions tend to be the ones who want to become politically engaged, right? That's a little hard to unpack.
Okay.
But certainly we can sort of say that that's the relationship. Those two things are strongly related to one another.
Part of what I'm concerned about is that there are some people suggesting that if you become more involved, you become more polarized. I've seen a lot of newspapers and, again, a lot of professors saying the way out of political polarization is we just need to activate more voters. We need to get those moderate voters activated. We need to get those independent voters activated. Well, if it's true, which I hear you were saying we're not know, but if it's true that being more engaged makes you more polarized, won't that just make the problem worse?
So, and that's the hope, that with more, if we had something. So I think it depends on exactly how you wanted to engage people, right? So I think the usual hope from that people express with that kind of sentiment is that we have something like compulsory turnout, right? Where everyone would have to vote, and then people who are less engaged and informed would monitor elections. That might work. Not very realistic, but it might work.
Thank you.
So I think when I talk to groups about what I think might work, I don't think there's no easy solution. There's no those internet has, there's one weird trick, right, to a flat belly or whatever that you see.
Thank you.
That doesn't exist for political polarization. So all I have are some small scale kind of things that people could do. Right?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you saying there isn't some silver spoon, some key missile that we could file? Congress comes together and passes a law. The American people come together and we make this legal change and everything snaps back together. Are you saying it's not going to be that simple? There's no silver bullet to kill this monster. It's other stuff.
No, that's right. There is no silver bullet that does this. It's a hard problem, right? With a lot of causes, right, and things rooted in technological and sociological changes. I would say that in the work that I've done, I've tried to think about what small scale things people could do, right, that might make things better. And so when we did the discussion experiments that I talk about in our Common Bonds, so what we did there, that was a very structured sort of thing, right? Because it was an experiment. We wanted to kind of hold things constant. What I tell people is that think about how you might incorporate some of that into your everyday life by learning. So I think the two biggest things I took away from that were the importance of listening and the importance of asking good questions. And what I mean by that. So the importance of listening, and this is very hard for an academic, because to become an academic, you kind of to like the sound of your own voice. Is that
you said it. I didn't.
you have to own your own biases. The thinking about, like, we often sort of say like, oh, I know why they think that, right? But really listening to people and having a better appreciation of why they hold the beliefs that they do can give us some insight. And it's not so much about changing someone's mind as it is about better understanding their point of view, right? And so it's valuable for two reasons, right? One is it helps us kind of sort of see where the other person is coming from, right? In that kind of perspective getting rather than perspective taking, which is the usual psychological term. Um, Perspective getting is valuable in and of itself. But I also tell people, because a lot of the people come to these things are very interested in politics, right? That if you want to persuade someone eventually, the only route to doing that is going to be to understand where they're coming from, right? So if you assume that like the reason why someone's a Democrat or Republican, a Trump supporter, a Biden supporter is because they're stupid and ill-informed, and all you need to do is share with them your great wisdom, that's not going to work, right?
Thank you.
But you have to understand. But if you understood where the other person is coming from, right, you might have a better chance of persuading them and getting them to at least think about changing their mind, right? And when I talk about asking good questions, right, you can think about questions that might shut down conversation as opposed to open it up. And you want to try to think about how to do the latter. So a question that might close down conversation, right, or produce an unproductive conversation would be something about, something that's either kind of leading, right, on a very charged topic, like, isn't it great that Donald Trump is now going to, face indictment again?
Right.
Something like that. Or isn't it great that, Republicans have exposed the fraud of, Hunter Biden, right? A question that opens up, conversation could be something that's maybe a little bit more interesting and might produce an unexpected answer. So, what's something that, your party has done that, really disappointed you, right? Or something where you really disagreed with, Trump or Biden in the last election, right? Something where you might sort of find something where you can generate a kind of space for some dialogue, right? And find some of those commonalities that people have on some of these things, right? Because there, part of what I think comes out of these kind of a lot of these studies on dialogue and discussion isn't that, all of a sudden everyone agrees on everything. It's sort of that, no, maybe we have a little bit better understanding, and maybe we see where there are some things where we can build from, and then maybe try to go from there to build up to something more constructive, right? Again, there's no like easy magic kind of thing that's going to just, fix all this. I mean, if I knew what that solution was, like I wouldn't be like hiding it to like trying
I'm just asking because we have people, again, a lot of times in the media, just get rid of social media, just get rid of news. Boy, if we could have some law, we could bring back the fairness doctrine of the 1980s and implement a couple laws, everything will snap back together. Just get rid of Donald Trump. Just make sure all the Republicans know that he was a bad guy. And we'll go back to this perfect time period. And I'm like, there wasn't a perfect time period before Trump. It was already polarization. I like what you're saying, and I totally agree. It sounds like what you're saying is if you're trying to understand why somebody went to January 6th, even if you disagree with going to January 6th and you think January 6th was an insurrection and coup, which I do, you can't walk up to somebody and go, hey, you went to January 6th because you're stupid, right?
Yeah, look, so yes, you have to try and understand the point of view. But the other thing I sort of say to people is I'll say, like, sometimes people say, well, then you're asking me to accept something I find, kind of really repugnant, right? And so my answer to that is that part of when we think about civility, right, people sometimes mistake that to be politesse, right? That civility just means like we talk to each other nicely. But actually, I think what civility means is something deeper. What it means is taking other people's arguments seriously, right? But on the assumption that everyone has a right to be in the kind of political sphere and the political space, right? So that the illegitimate arguments become ones that say, well, some people don't deserve membership in the political sphere, right?
Right.
That we think about people having some right to be there, but that doesn't mean that you get to say like, oh, well, it's okay to spout racist things or transphobic things or whatever, right? That everyone has that same right to kind of participate and be part of the political process.
I wanted to ask you about our common bonds, and I've heard other people say what you were saying. We need to start having quality interactions between people. We're not talking, we're not interacting, but that doesn't mean go out and insult them or repeat your Fox News or MSNBC talking points. It means, try to understand them, try to get, why are they thinking that, instead of just assuming, like the TV channels and the social media says, well, they're part of a cult, a pizza child abuse cult, or the Donald Trump cult, or they're stupid, or they're crazy, or they secretly want to destroy America and totally control you. Get rid of that. Start thinking like, maybe this is a quasi-rational person who saw some things that scared them and came to this conclusion. And maybe I haven't seen those things too. Maybe I should take 5 seconds to try to understand what is it they saw in their view that helped them come to their conclusion. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and I think that's right. Not, and look, there are going to be, what I always tell people is that like start small and try to do this, in kind of like low stakes things. And it's not always going to work, right? Because there are going to be some people that you're not going to be able to find a
Right.
ton of common bonds, but that doesn't mean that it's not worth searching for.
Let's say we got everybody to read your book and everybody goes, this is the solution on the left and on the right. Given that there's some evidence showing that we've been polarized since 1992 and increasingly polarized and more, how long would it take for America to have all these interpersonal conversations before we got to a point where the polarization wasn't an issue? Like, if we all do this, we engage in this public project, we want to heal America. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm willing to jump out, talk to my neighbor, get involved. 200 million people do it. How long does it take for us to reduce our anger? Because people seem really mad at each other.
Good question, but I think I might change the question a little bit,
Sure.
right? In a way that I'm not sure that. So look, the level of polarization we have now isn't, it's too high, right? But I don't think the solution is zero polarization, right? In part because what partisanship does, right, is it helps us clarify that there are big important policy choices, right, at stake about the way we kind of govern society, right, the way we write the rules to do a wide variety of different things, regulate markets, right, invest in different sorts of policy areas, right, things like what the Inflation Reduction Act did, right, that some polarization is probably actually a good thing, right, because it's highlighting that there are these big important consequences that are at stake in elections. So I think it's more about reducing some of that, for lack of, sort of like false polarization or like undue polarization, right, and trying to have a better understanding of each other so that we can work together to find more constructive solutions to problems.
This sounds like a generational project. Like, this is something that's going to be a long, slow, hard slog, like how we had to get the idea that African American people have the right to vote, women have the right to vote, minorities have the right to vote, smoking is bad for your health. Those things took decades for those ideas to settle in, and it was conversations at the local level. Is that what we're looking at here?
Probably. Like, I think again, these things don't change, quickly, but they're like, all I would say is that hard things are often worth doing.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Took us a while to get here. Might take us a while to get out.
Yes.
The other question, one of the last questions I had for you was, you really did a lot of work on how do we fix polarization and how do we have the right kinds of conversations with each other. and you pointed out something I've heard from others. You can't just walk up to somebody and start talking. That could, on the other side, that could end badly. Especially like if you say, so you're a Donald Trump supporter, right? That means you're crazy. That's not going to go well. Try to understand them first. Can you, if we look at the map of political polarization that we looked at earlier for national elections and congressional, there's some hardcore red landslide districts and hardcore blue landslide districts. Let's say you're in a hardcore blue landslide district. If you go to your local coffee shop and talk to a Republican in your hardcore blue landslide district, is that as effective as reaching out to a Republican in a hardcore Republican landslide district? So you're in a blue landslide district. Is it okay to just go, hey, I went to my corner coffee store and I talked to a Republican who generally lives surrounded by a bunch of liberals, and he basically agreed with most of what I said? Or is the real conversation to have, you're in downtown San Francisco and you're talking to somebody in rural Kentucky? I mean, red, blue.
I would say I think the most effective ones are going to be ones where you can think about other things that might, some other kind of shared identities that might help you kind of open up that space for dialogue. So here's a kind of more prosaic example of it, right? Like something like sports fandom that gives you a bit of a kind of common, kind of bonding, where you can do something where you can say like, okay, well, like we have something else in common, and like I can see this is sort of like a good, reasonable person, right? So maybe like they're not so crazy when it comes to politics, right?
Right.
And so I think the one way of thinking about how to approach it might be find things where you can use something that's apolitical to kind of bridge the divide to help you then have that deeper political conversation.
Right. I have family in Texas and they're Republicans. I'm not. And I know a few people who are Republicans here in California and Santa Monica and the Bay Area. The Bay Area Republicans are vastly more accepting of certain liberal positions on social issues than the Texas Republicans. I mean, the Texas Republicans are hardcore about God and guns and no LGBTQ. And I have other Republicans here in California who go, yeah, of course we need gun regulations. Of course we need some environmental regulations. Of course you can't hate on LGBTQ people. And so I don't see these Republicans in coastal California and rural Texas as being the same. And I'm wondering if I, as a liberal, reach out to my coastal Republican and I go, hey, we had a great conversation. We bonded. Am I really healing the country? Because there's still the division between me and the rural part.
I mean, great question. I think it's going to be harder to do those really big bridging conversations. Like that's going to be harder and it's going to require more trust. But I want to make another, analogy. So people who've worked on one of the biggest sort of social shifts and fastest social shifts has been the acceptance of LGBT individuals, right? Support for gay marriage. In the 1990s, I mean, that was basically a laughable position. And then, I think the Obergefell decision was more of a fait accompli than something that really changed a lot of
Totally agree.
And if you look at people who've studied that, like one of the really effective things was doing, this kind of personalized, storytelling approach, what's sometimes called like deep canvassing, right? Is that kind of fancier academic name for it, where
deep
you kind of so that's the like academic-y name for it, which is where you have these like in-depth conversations with people about this, and you give like the kind of personal story around it. I think why that's effective is that it's easy to kind of hate on some abstract idea, right? It's much harder to do that with like an actual person when they're telling you their experience, right? And that I think some of the, when you go back and you look at things people said about LGBT people in the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, right? It looks a lot like some of the things people say about transgender people today. And part of it is that just a lot of people, right, who hold those very strong positions. I think if you said like, well, have you ever interacted with an actual transgender person, right? Not someone you saw on social media, not someone you saw on TV, like an actual person where you had a real kind of face-to-face conversation with them? I think the answer, right? No, actually, the answer, because this from survey data, that the answer is no, right? And that's part of why I think, like, thinking about how to have those personal conversations, right, is something that's maybe a little bit more valuable, where you can kind of hear that perspective. And that's why I think there's value in doing it, even if you have to do it on that, kind of smaller scale thing, right? Start with things that are maybe more tractable and then kind of build out from there.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, we're winding down. Last two questions. Last two or three. First, was there something you wanted to talk about, a subject matter, an article, a book, or statement or concept you felt you weren't able to express? I want to make sure.
No, I think we covered a lot of stuff in the interview.
I really appreciate your time. I really, really appreciate it, because you helped clear up a lot of questions I have. And I'm trying to do this so that the public follows along and helps them understand better. One of the last questions I have is, did you personally experience or see polarization at Penn State? I've talked to some other professors in Iowa and stuff, and they said, oh, yeah, it was different after Trump came through town, even when he was gone.
So when I was an undergrad, no, but that was a long time ago.
Sure.
And Penn is sort of a different, place. I don't know that changed that much before and after. But I think, unfortunately, that higher education has also become politicized in a very unfortunate way that doesn't help America. So, as someone who spent time living outside the U.S., and admittedly, I move in kind of a weird circle, right, with lots of other people who are academics in other places. People from other countries, when you ask them, like, what they think one of the big strengths of America is, right, even just sort of ordinary people in a lot of other places, they say, oh, you have such great universities, you bring such great talent from all over the world, and you have this sort of great experience, that if we lose that and lose sight of that, then that's really a way in which we've harmed ourselves. And if you look, Canada opened up a program to allow people who are trying to get H-1B visas or have H-1B visas in the U.S., which is the high-tech kind of worker visa.
Right.
And they said, we're going to allow 10,000 of those people to come to Canada to help our economy grow. The platform crashed. More than 10,000 applications were submitted in a matter of minutes. And that should worry all of us, because those people bring a lot of innovation, and there's other sorts of things. So, I think that's why as an academic, I worry about some of the kind of polarization around these kind of higher ed issues, because this has long-term consequences for, not just higher education, but American society and the American economy more generally.
I've heard a lot of professors say that almost every professor who studies political science is liberal. Not my opinion. I've heard other people say that. They said you'd have to struggle to find anybody who's an avowed Republican and is a political science professor. But again, just something I've heard. I don't know. Does that seem accurate, or does that seem wildly off to you?
So I think I would say then two things. So it is true that university faculty are more Democratic than Republican. But there is a current of conservatives or conservatism in parts of the academy. I would say that there are probably fewer pro-Trump academics, right?
Right.
So there are going to be more. The people who are on the right are going to be people who are more kind of classical, kind of liberals, right? Someone like a Robert George or a Harvey Mansfield or someone like that, just like two really prominent examples, right? But I think that also in a way kind of, misses a bit of the point that, like, it's not so much about like being taught by liberals and conservatives, right? But having people who can help students find the best version of their own ideas, right? And all the evidence we have suggests that faculty politics doesn't really have a big impact on students, the much bigger impact is what their peers think.
Mm.
That they're not so affected by,
Mm.
what we do, which if you've ever taught in a college classroom won't surprise you, because it's really hard. It's hard to get students to do things like not call everything a novel, actually do the reading, right? All of these sorts of things were like much more basic things rather than like indoctrination with political views.
I did all of the things you just said when I was in college to my professors, and I want to apologize to you on behalf of everybody 25 years ago. I'm sorry. I was just, just reading a bunch, and I was like, not another book. God. Yeah. Is it just part of the concern is that I've read a couple books by very established, very well respected, very intelligent authors, and they were very well researched, and they were talking about political polarization. And then somewhere along the times, it ends with, "Come on, guys, we know it's really all the Republicans' fault." Like, yeah, I mentioned the left here a couple times in the book, but really the left doesn't need to do anything, and we could basically just summarize that it's all the Republicans' fault. And I'm just thinking, would turn off the lay public? I mean, if we're trying to get everybody in America to work together, to come together, and we go, look, hey, conservatives, academic America has basically concluded it's all your fault. I could see that really turning them off and them not wanting to be part of the solution to help America. And that's the concern I have. Fair concern or not really an issue?
I think what I would say is that there are ways in which this has been asymmetric. So if you look at the data, especially the elite level, right, Republicans have changed more than Democrats have. But I think in terms of getting this productively, important to kind of acknowledge that, but it's also important to think about the way in which you can have that conversation most productively with people. And that's not going to be by just saying, well, this is all your fault.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I've been waiting for that. Thank you. I mistyped this question. What I meant was, and you gave a great answer to another thing I wanted to hear about. Pennsylvania State, not the university, just you as an American, having lived through times. Apparently you've been in Pennsylvania for a while. Have you noticed in your personal life outside of the university, just, a man with two working eyes, you go, well, that's different. I remember when people used to not do that to each other, and that's different. Have you seen anything like that, or has life basically stayed the same over the last 20 years?
I mean, there's some indicators of that, right? That politics has become more visible in all of our lives in ways it wasn't before, right? But I think what I would say is that that doesn't mean that you can still engage in constructive ways with people from a variety of different viewpoints.
Of course. And I totally agree. I've talked to a lot of liberals, a lot of conservatives, and it can be done. And we need to have a lot more of it. And I think that would be the first thing to heal America, is if we actually had quality, non-judgmental conversations that were aimed at just trying to understand. Like you said, you got to understand first. If you want to persuade them, okay, but first you got to understand them. Okay, last two questions. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person watching this video. It's a week from now. They've learned a lot. Boy, they had a lot of questions and they got answered, and they go, wow, I really learned a lot. I'm struggling to retain it all because there was a lot of material, but there was this one thing that the professor said, and it's 5 days after I watched that video, and I can't get that thought out of my head. What is that one thought you want a random person to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days after watching this video?
So I'll give you one research thing and one practical thing. So the research thing is that part of polarization comes from people's misperceptions of the other side. Right? They tend to, like we talked about, they tend to take those really kind of extreme exemplars and substitute them for kind of everyone else. And the practical thing is the point that we talked about earlier, that listening is more important than talking when trying to, kind of understand people from the other side.
Would it help if we had elites doing that? Like if Joe Biden came out and he goes, you know what? I don't like Trump. I think he's a bad guy. I think he's bad for America. But I'm going to try to sit down with him for an hour and just listen, not judge him. And I'm going to try to do it on TV because I think that's what we should do as people. Would that help the public get behind this if we started to see elites say, I'm going to do it. I'm going to sit down and listen with somebody who I detest, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I'm going to go and sit down with Marjorie Taylor Greene for an hour, and I'm not going to judge, and I'm not going to say anything snarky, and I'm not going to tweet out anything mean afterwards. Just going to listen. Would that help encourage the public to do this?
Possibly, but I think there's a danger in the elite space that doesn't exist for the ordinary public, and that that might be better done at the elite level, kind of behind closed doors. Because remember that elites also have to work with each other to negotiate these sort of policy deals. And so it's valuable to give them the space they need to kind of operate behind closed doors, right? So that's one way in which, some of these efforts at transparency and sunshine can sometimes be counterproductive, because by putting everything out in the open, then it makes it harder for people to kind of, cut deals behind the scenes and, find compromises that might otherwise be harder to do.
It's interesting. That's interesting. Because this is another magical solution being offered. Just get rid of social media, just get news. And if Joe Biden and Trump could hug each other and say, I'll listen to you, that, it'd be a kumbaya moment. I haven't heard somebody say, look, maybe that's not a good idea for the elites to signal that way. They have difference of issues, because that's being held out as a thing. If we just had the elites signal that we could talk to each other, everything snaps back together. And I totally agree with you. There's no silver bullet, but I constantly see newspapers providing that, going, oh, no, here's the silver bullet. Last thought. I hope you found this was a fair interview.
Yeah.
You don't have to name anybody, but we always ask, do you know anybody who might be willing to be part of an honest conversation? We always ask if you have any recommendations. Just try to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't remember if you've had them on the show, but I think some really interesting folks can be some of the folks involved with Braver Angels and some of their team. There's also a group called the Civic Health Project that's working to try and do some of this dialogue. Other groups like Unify, Listen First. So there's a lot of folks in the kind of informally get called this bridging space that, if you haven't had them on, I think could be good folks to talk to, because they try to do a lot of this work on a much more kind of practical sort of level.
I really appreciate that. Thank you very much for your time, Professor. Thank you very much for answering all the questions. I really appreciate you helping us clarify a lot of things. And I will send you a copy of this interview in the next couple of hours.
Okay, great. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you, Professor. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.